Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
Hello, sports fans, and welcome to another edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, where we examine the best moments in sports 1 week at a time. I am your host, Dana Augusta, and this week we're going to take a look at the events in sports history from February 28th to March the 6th that will be in our top 5, which will also include a couple of notable name changes that occurred this week, which will become synonymous with sports greatness. Also, a future heavyweight champion making a thundering debut in Albany, New York, and the greatest night for a pro player in NBA history in a game that never officially ended. And also we will discuss this week's Shootout, which would be the 1970 Jacksonville University Dolphins basketball team. The first team in NCAA history to average over 100 points per game in a full season, led by an iconic pro player in both the ABA and NBA that had one of the greatest runs for a small school in NCAA tournament history. And now, the main event. And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. I'm Dana Augusta, and this is this week's main event. And the main event is, of course, the NBA All-Star Weekend, or All-Star Game, which has been condensed because of COVID-19 restrictions. But the excitement and the overall anticipation of the All-Star Weekend here in Atlanta has been palpable, to say the least, as someone who lives here really truly knows, dealing with the traffic every day. But of course, that's another story. But this weekend, the beautiful southern city of Atlanta is the center of the basketball universe, as it is hosting the 2021 NBA All-Star Game, the NBA's midseason glamour event of both entertainment and hoops right here in the Peach City. As with any year, the participants in the All-Star Weekend are best of the best when it comes to shooting, dunking, and overall skills. And All-Star Saturday night was one of the highlights of the NBA season, where players are awarded individual honors in the three-point shootout, the skills competition, and the dunk contest. While watching the festivities on television every year, I would find myself reminiscing on how All-Star Weekend was during my junior high years and my high school years and some college years, on how cool it was and all the reasons why I would look forward to this every single year. And I began to think to myself, why don't I come up with a scenario or have an ultimate all-star game with the greatest players that I have ever seen in my life with these two eyes. So this is what this week's main event will be about. Coming up with the greatest three-point shootout, the greatest skills competition, and the greatest dunk contest, along with an ultimate all-star game with the most iconic players from the 80s and 90s and today coming together to hoops for one major game and ultimate bragging rights, to say the least. Now, to me, that would be very, very interesting, and I hope that it will be interesting to all of you listening out there on this podcast. So, without further ado, let's take a gander at what I've come up with. Now, for the three-point shootout, of course, the three-point shootout is very simple. Who can make the most three-pointers in a certain amount of time? And in the beginning, when they first started this in the mid-'80s, there was one man that was better than everybody else coming out there with the warm-up jacket with the Celtics written across it. Of course, that was, Mr. Larry Bird. He won it 3 times. As a matter of fact, he won the first 3 long-distance shootouts, as it was called back then. And he's one of 2 3-time winners that's on this list. The others on the list that would be in competition with Larry Bird would be one person that a lot of people I think have forgotten about as a great three-point shooter, but he's been kind of lost in that, but he won it twice. And that was a man by the name of Mark Price from the Cleveland Cavaliers. He won it in 1993 and 1994. Of course, when you have Mark Price, you have other players that have won it twice, including Peja Stojakovic, who won it in 2003 and in 2004. Craig Hodges is the only other person to win the competition 3 times with the Chicago Bulls. Others include, of course, current players, Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors, and then you have a lot of other notables. Dirk Nowitzki of the Dallas Mavericks, Drazen Petrovic of the New Jersey Nets, Reggie Miller, of course, one of the greatest clutch three-point shooters who ever lived, Michael Adams, who at one point held the record for the most consecutive games with at least 1 three-pointer, Tim Legler, currently of ESPN, but once upon a time won a three-point contest in 1996. And another Hall of Famer, Chris Mullin. Now, these shooters are best from the best from three-point land. Larry Bird was the obvious choice of winning the first 3 three-point shootouts. In the third year, Craig Hodges dethroned him. The others on the list made a living behind the stripe, including little known and little in stature Michael Adams of the Bullets, like aforementioned, with at least 1 three-point field goal in 79 consecutive games. Others include former champions. It would be one of the most entertaining aspects to have these legendary long-distance shooters compete for at least bragging rights of all time behind the three-point line. Another event that was caught my eye, and this kind of happened kind of recently, was the skills competition. Now, the skills competition combines speed, passing, shooting, and these players were the best in weaving in and out of trouble in pressure situations, making key plays when their teams needed it. You couldn't have a skills competition without the all-time games assist leader, and that's John Stockton, who will lead the way in this competition. Others include Kevin Johnson of the Phoenix Suns, one of the best pressure-packed point guards to ever play the game, but he's been somewhat lost over the years, because of his lack of playoff success. But he was one of the great cogs of the wheel for the Phoenix Suns in the late 80s and early 90s. Others, Chris Paul is another who's somewhat in that mold of a Kevin Johnson. John Starks of the New York Knicks, who led the Knicks to the 1994 NBA Finals alongside Patrick Ewing. Kevin Johnson, as before mentioned, Rolando Blackman of the Dallas Mavericks, one of the most underrated players in NBA history as far as his overall skill set. He's someone who could literally play anywhere on the court, ask him to do anything and he could do it for you. With those great Dallas Mavericks teams with him, along with Mark Aguirre, those teams were just great, coached by John McLeod back in the late 80s. And a couple of current players that could really put some pressure on the older guys. One is Giannis Antetokounmpo of the Milwaukee Bucks. As he's way bigger than all of these guys, but he's no less agile than all of these others. Tremendously agile. That's why they call him the Greek Freak. And finally, you have Kyrie Irving of the Brooklyn Nets, who could pretty much do anything with the basketball, even some things that hasn't even seen yet. He is just that great with the basketball in his hands. And finally, the crown jewel of All-Star Saturday Night, of course, you have the Slam Dunk Contest. And simply put, these are the greatest in-game dunkers to have ever laced up a pair of sneakers. First of all, you have the king. Air Jordan himself, Michael Jordan, along with Dominique Wilkins, a human highlight film of the Atlanta Hawks. Also participating, believe it or not, will be LeBron James, along with Kobe Bryant, Vince Carter, Spud Webb, who won it in 1986, standing only 5'7" tall, took away the trophy that year. And the man who started all has to be part of this in his prime, and it has to be Dr. J, Julius Irving of the Sixers. Clyde the Glide Drexler of the Portland Trail Blazers, and another former winner, Jason Richardson of the Golden State Warriors. That would be my ultimate dunk contest, and those participants would take a high wire act and showmanship and power and all of those things combined into it, one of the greatest dunk contests that you could ever come across and ever could even conceive of. That would be worth the price of admission, of course, anytime with those dunkers putting on the show for you guys. To conclude, that would conclude All-Star Saturday Night, and there will be an event that everyone will be waiting to see. And of course, when you have All-Star Weekend, the crown jewel will be the next day, will be the All-Star Game. And where else would it have something like that to take place? It would have to take place in Madison Square Garden, the mecca of basketball in New York City. How can you have an ultimate All-Star Game without being there? And then putting together this team of NBA legends that I've seen through the 1980s and 1990s and today, it'll be, of course, divide up Eastern Conference versus Western Conference, in which I have put together right here for you guys today. First of all, we have the Eastern Conference. And when you think of the Eastern Conference from the 1980s and 90s, and to the present day, you think of tough, rugged players that had an abundance of skill and attitude. And this team features all of those things in abundance. And it features the power of LeBron James and Patrick Ewing, the trash talking of Larry Bird and Charles Barkley, and the tenacious leadership and competitive nature of Michael Jordan and Isaiah Thomas. Plus, coaching the East would be a player that could keep all of the chaos to a minimum, and I can't think of anybody else than Phil Jackson of the Chicago Bulls. In my opinion, the greatest basketball coach in NBA history. Now, the starters would simply be these guys. At point guard, I would have Isaiah Thomas, led the Pistons to back-to-back NBA titles in the late 80s, and followed, and at shooting guard starting, of course, would be Michael Jeffrey Jordan of the Chicago Bulls. Follow that up would be small forward would be LeBron James. And at power forward starting would be at Larry Bird, 6'9", three-time NBA champion of the Boston Celtics. And rounding out the starting five would be Patrick Ewing of the New York Knicks. Now, the reserves, I had to go back and forth on these because my reserves are going to be, I have some controversial picks. I had to keep some people off, but these are the best that I have ever seen. And I think that these guys really fit into the mold of what the Eastern Conference really was during my lifetime. The 2 point guards, now to break it down, I have each position have 2 reserves each one. I got 2 reserve point guards, 2 reserve shooting guards, 2 reserve small forwards, 2 reserve power forwards, and 2 centers. Okay, those are guys that's coming off the bench. And the 2 point guards that I have is Maurice Cheeks of the Sixers and Tim Hardaway of the Miami Heat. Tim Hardaway, of course, is known for his crossover, what he affectionately calls the U-step, two-step. And Maurice Cheeks, one of the coolest under pressure guards to have ever played in the NBA, played alongside Dr. J and Moses Malone with Philadelphia in the early 80s, won that championship in 1983 with Philly. At shooting guard, the greatest clutch shooter of all time, Reggie Miller of the Pacers. And the other shooting guard is Allen Iverson of the Sixers. One of the most electrifying, one of the greatest ball handlers ever to play in the NBA. The 2 small forwards will have an abundance of scoring coming off the bench at that position, which would be Julius Irving and Bernard King. Julius Irving, of course, of the Sixers, and Bernard King, one of the most underrated shooters and pure scorers that the league has ever seen, who played for the New York Knicks during the 80s. At power forward, you have two of the most opposite people to ever play the game. At one end, you have Charles Barkley, the round mound of rebound in his prime with the Philadelphia 76ers. And the other power forward is Kevin Mchale, the man with 1,001 post moves down low, who could do pretty much anything down low if you ask, whatever you ask him to, he could pull it off. At center, you have Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale's teammate in Boston. Bird, Parrish, and Mchale, known as quite simply the greatest front court to have ever played the game together with the Celtics in the 80s. Robert Parrish would be the reserve center, along with Moses Malone, Mr. Fo himself, of the Philadelphia 76ers. That would be my Eastern Conference ultimate all-star team. Now, moving out west, and of course, when you talk about the Western Conference during the 80s and 90s, there will be so much scoring and so much smooth and just outright just tremendous offensive basketball talent is truly would be unbelievable. While the Eastern Conference is a little rough around the edges, the Western Conference All-Stars features high scoring, high wire acts that would keep everyone in attendance on the edge of their seats. Now, the floor leader, of course, would be Magic Johnson. And adding to the mix would be his backcourt mate, Kobe Bryant, which even with that image of Magic and Kobe playing with each other, I should say, in the backcourt would make so many Laker fans drool with anticipation just to see that. All of their Laker fantasies would come to life, with Kobe getting passes from Magic. Adding to the players above the rim would be guys like Clyde Drexler and high scoring reserves like Kevin Durant, George Gervin, and Sean Kemp. Adding to the balance of the team would be Tim Duncan and Akeem Olajuwon down low. And coaching the Western Conference would be Pat Riley, obviously. Especially because it would be a logical choice to have Riley as coach, because who else would tell Kareem and Shaq that they're not starting? Okay, and that'll be pretty much the way I would see it. Now, the starters would be, of course, Irving, Magic Johnson of the Lakers would be the starting point guard, with Kobe Bryant as a shooting guard. The small forward would be Clyde Drexler, the 6'7" swing man from the Portland Trail Blazers, who could play any number of positions. He's like the Swiss Army knife of that squad. Power forward will be Tim Duncan, very smooth, Mr. Fundamentals, as Shaq used to call him, starring with the San Antonio Spurs. And Akeem Olajuwon of the Houston Rockets. Akeem, the two-time Finals MVP in 1994 and 1995 with the Rockets. The centerpiece of those Rockets teams in the mid-90s. And as aforementioned, Pat Riley, the head coach of the Los Angeles Lakers, with his pedigree and his overall LA style and for his coaching acumen, he would be a logical choice to lead the West. Now, the reserves point guard, of course, would be John Stockton. But at the same time, another point guard that I kind of was going back and forth with, I went with Gary Payton, the glove, because it can't be all offense. You got to have some defense. And Gary Payton, known as the glove, was known for his defense and overall just outstanding play. Gary Payton of the Seattle Supersonics was one of the greatest on-the-ball defenders you could ever possibly see in any level of basketball. The shooting guards will be George Gervin, the Iceman of the San Antonio Spurs. We're going a little bit old school with George Gervin, but I did see him play toward the late stages of his career. And let me tell you, George Gervin was the smoothest basketball player you could ever want to see. Another guy that's just as smooth is the other shooting guard that's on the squad, and that's Steph Curry. Steph Curry has in the gym range. When you talk about shooters, as soon as he walks into the gym, Steph Curry could light it up from anywhere on the court. The small forwards would be Chris Mullin of the Golden State Warriors, once again, number 17, part of that great Run TMC offense out in Oakland during the late 80s with Mitch Richmond and Tim Hardaway and Chris Mullin. Those teams, coached by Don Nelson, was one of one of the most underrated teams in the 80s with those guys and Kevin Durant, the Slim Reaper himself. He played for a lot of different teams, of course, I know, but I remember him most, and he had the most success with Golden State, but Oklahoma City to me is his home, but that's another story for another day. The two power forwards, Karl Malone of the Utah Jazz, a Louisiana kid like myself, for the Karl Malone, the mailman, him and John Stockton, those two get together. There's magic to be happening on the court. And of course, Sean Kemp of the Seattle Supersonics, the Rain Man from Seattle. What can you say about this guy? 6'10", but plays like he's 6'4". Very athletic, tremendously aggressive, 1,000 low post moves. What more can you say about the Rain Man while he was with the Seattle Supersonics? Shag and Kareem, two Laker iconic centers. You can't go wrong with either one. Both of them will be, coming in and out of the game. With Kareem, the all-time scoring leader in NBA history with his famous sky hook, and Shaquille O'Neal, the most intimidating force the league has ever seen in any way, shape, or form. That would be my ultimate, we just heard, is my NBA ultimate beyond words All-Star Weekend. This is something that I had thought about for years and years and years. If only wish I could put that together. It wouldn't that be entertaining, to say the least. And now, this week's Top 5. Hello once again, and welcome back to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, where we examine sports history 1 week at a time. Once again, I'm your host, Dana Augusta, and just a reminder for all of you out there that you can follow the show on Twitter at HistoricallySP2, or you could hit us up on the Sports History Network website, where there are a huge collection of sports shows and sports history shows with a great group of talented individuals ready to give you some of the best insight and some of the best stories sports history has to offer. So check us out. We've at the Sports History Network, where we have a whole long list of guys that are very, very talented at what they do. And now this week's Top 5. And this week's Top 5 deals with a very different list of people. And the first one to start off with is number 5. Peter Uberoff becomes Major League Baseball commissioner. Peter Uberoff led the effort to bring the Summer Olympics in 1984 to Los Angeles after a long gap where the U.S. hadn't hosted the Olympics. In fact, the last time they had hosted the Olympics before 1984 was in 1932, which of course was also in Los Angeles. And that's of course the Summer Olympics. They had 2 Winter Olympics in between there, once in 1960 and again in 1980. But 1984 marked the first time that the Summer Olympics would be held on American soil since 1932. And Peter Uberoff was the one who led the way to lure the Olympic Committee to Los Angeles and once again at the LA Coliseum. And it was a huge, huge success because I remember watching that as a kid growing up. And he became commissioner right after the Olympics ended. In fact, I think he took over as commissioner from Bowie Kuhn around October of that year. So the number 5 event that took place this week in 1984 was Peter Uberoff becoming commissioner of baseball. Number 4, this week in history, Mike Tyson in 1985 made his debut in Albany, New York, his professional debut, by knocking out Hector Mercedes in the first round. In fact, it only took him a minute and 47 seconds into the first round to claim his first professional victory in typical Mike Tyson style. He knocked out Mercedes in the first round in Albany, New York, and he was the headline of the bill. I remember seeing the highlights of it, and it was just a dominating performance by Iron Mike. Number 3, Bayview Stadium in San Francisco opens, but a lot of people don't know it as Bayview Stadium. The New York Giants had recently moved to San Francisco in 1958, and so they decided to change the name to not only Bayview Stadium. They decided to change the name basically because of its location. The location of the stadium was a place called Candlestick Point in San Francisco, so they eventually changed the name that week in 1959 to Candlestick Park, where it became one of the iconic stadiums in all of America and all of American pro sports, the home of the San Francisco Giants for a long, long time. And of course, the site of so many great San Francisco 49er games over the years. So once upon a time, Candlestick Park was also known as Bayview Stadium. But thanks to the San Francisco Giants, they decided to change the name to Candlestick Park. Number 3, another notable name change. In 1964, Cassius Clay changed his name because of his religion, converting to the Nation of Islam, changed his name to Muhammad Ali. This happened just a few days after Muhammad Ali knocked out Sonny Liston in the 7th round in Miami Beach. And because of his religious beliefs, he decided that he didn't want to be called Cassius Clay anymore because he figured that it was a slave name, which ironically enough, Cassius Clay, the boxer, was actually named after an abolitionist named Cassius Clay. So that's kind of a little bit of a strange twist or irony, that sort of thing. And number 1, possibly and by far the greatest single game performance in NBA history, and it's been approached by a couple of people, but no one has ever really got there, and I don't think anyone would ever reach this. The number 1 event this week in history was Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game in Hershey, Pennsylvania. In the game, he scored the 100 points, but here's a strange fact that nobody really realizes, is the fact that the game ended when he hit this 100 point. There was still like 30-some seconds left to play in the game, and they didn't even finish the game because the fans that were there in attendance in Hershey was so impressed by Wilt Chamberlain's performance for the 100-point game that people started to emerge out of the stands to congratulate Wilt because of 100 points. That's something that no one in NBA history had ever done before, and certainly haven't done since. One of the greatest, and by far the greatest, offensive performance by one player in NBA history, of course, Wilt Chamberlain, 1962, this week in Hershey, Pennsylvania. That was this week's top 5. And coming up next to close out the show, the shout out. And we have one big shout out this week, and it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, coming up right after this. Okay, and to wrap up this week's show, we're going to be talking about the 1970 Jacksonville University Dolphins, which is the subject of this week's shout out. And the shout out to the Dolphins in 1970. They finished that year 27-2 overall as an independent. And what's notable about that team was a couple of things. First, they were the first team in NCAA history to average over 100 points a game for a full season. And secondly, to couple with their overall win-loss record, they had one of the most iconic NBA and ABA players of that era, and that is 7'1" Artis Gilmore, who was 7'1" but 7'5" with the afro. And the Dolphins were a powerhouse that was just an incredible offensive machine that year. Of course, averaging over 100 points per game was nothing to sneeze at, which was during a time that had no three-point line. Another key player on that squad was a 6'5" guard named Rex Marker, who later became a coach in the Continental Basketball Association in the early 1980s. It was drafted right out of Jacksonville University by the Celtics in 1972, I believe it was. But Gilmore was the lead cog in that Dolphins attack. at center, playing at 7'1", obviously playing center. He would be a second-team All-American at Jacksonville University. The Dolphins would earn an invite to the 1970 tournament based on their incredible 27-2 record, and they started the season 13-0. Their first and only loss during the regular season came on January the 27th. Their only regular season loss to in-state rival Florida State, which was led by future NBA All-Star and Hall of Famer Dave Cowens, who would go on to be Finals MVP in 1974 with the Celtics, and when they beat the Milwaukee Bucks in one of the best NBA Finals of all time. They would lose to the Seminoles that year, 89-83 that day for their only regular season loss. But they entered the tournament as a 6th ranked team on the AP poll, and they opened the tournament that year and beat Western Kentucky, who was the 12th ranked team in the country, 109-96, as Gilmore would score 30 points and add 19 rebounds in that first round game. The second round game was a little bit tighter. In fact, very tight against Iowa. Gilmore would lead the way with 30 points and 17 rebounds as the Dolphins would win another one, 104-103. The little school from North Florida continued to do their work, especially as the tournament shifted from Dayton, Ohio to Columbus, Ohio in the regional final, where they would face high-powered University of Kentucky, one of the true college basketball blue bloods. Jacksonville led by 28 points from Rex Morgan and 20 rebounds from Gilmore as they secured a 106-100 win to move them to their first ever trip to the Final Four that year, which would be played at Cole Fieldhouse in College Park, Maryland. In the national semifinal, they would find themselves taking on St. Bonaventure, led by another future NBA Hall of Famer, Bob Lanier. But unfortunately for the Brown Indians of St. Bonaventure, they would be without the services of Lanier because Lanier had injured his knee the game before against Villanova, but somehow the St. Bonnies managed to make their way into the Final Four. But without the services of Bob Lanier, the St. Bonaventure would be no match for Gilmore and the rest of the Jacksonville Dolphins as their unbelievable Cinderella run would continue all the way to the national championship game as Jacksonville would knock off St. Bonaventure 91-83 with Gilmore chipping in with 29 points and 21 rebounds. So the finals, the Dolphins would find themselves taking on UCLA, the class of college basketball, and winners of 6 of the last 7 national titles. But that's where the dream and the run of the Jacksonville Dolphins would come to an end. Gilmore was only limited to 19 points as the Dolphins would lose to UCLA 80-69 in the national championship game. Behind the play of Bruins backcourt duo of Sidney Wicks and Curtis Rowe, the Dolphins was no match as UCLA racked up a huge lead in the second half after the Dolphins actually had the lead for most of the first half. But the Bruins, it was, of course, their 6th national championship in 7 years. Gilmore would, of course, graduate and leave Jacksonville University to the ABA, where he was the top pick of the Kentucky Colonels of the ABA, and later on would join the NBA after the ABA's dispersal draft in 1976, where he would join the Chicago Bulls and play the remainder of his career. Well, that would do it for this week's edition of the Historically Speaking podcast. I'm glad everyone was able to check me out this week, and stay tuned for another edition coming up pretty soon. So until next time, y'all have a great week, and I'll catch you on the flip side.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.